In the first-class cabin of Flight 847 from LAX to Tokyo, a young flight attendant was about to face the kind of passenger that turns polite skies into pressure cookers. A routine transpacific shift turned deadly serious when a belligerent tech CEO unleashed a storm of harassment at 35,000 feet. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical retiree in Seat 3A. For decades, he served as a martial artist, security consultant, and tactical operations specialist, known for dismantling conflicts in high-stakes situations without firing a shot. When Carter Vale crossed the line from arrogant to abusive, he had no idea he was taunting a master of restraint trained in dozens of ways to end conflict before it begins. Seagal rose not with fists, but with calm authority that would trigger a reckoning among passengers and crew alike. What began as an entitled customer demanding respect would become a mid-air confrontation about dignity, strength, and decency. The first-class cabin would never be the same after Steven Seagal stepped into the aisle. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first-class cabin of Flight 847 from LAX to Tokyo hummed with the kind of quiet luxury that money could buy. Soft amber lighting cast warm shadows across cream-colored leather seats arranged in spacious pairs, each one a private sanctuary 40,000 feet above the Pacific. The Airbus A350's premier cabin represented the pinnacle of modern aviation comfort, where the wealthy retreated from the world's chaos into a cocoon of privilege and polish. Naomi Ruiz moved through the aisle with practiced grace, her smile bright despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. At 28, she had worked her way up from regional flights to domestic routes, and now finally to this coveted transpacific assignment. Her uniform was immaculate, her hair pulled back in a regulation bun, but her dark eyes betrayed the excitement and anxiety of someone determined to prove herself worthy of this promotion. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. McCann," she said softly, approaching an elderly woman who was fumbling with her seatbelt. The woman looked up with watery blue eyes, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she tried to manage the buckle. "Oh, thank you, dear," Mrs. McCann whispered, her voice carrying the weight of recent grief. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a flyer. My late husband always handled these things." She gestured helplessly at the array of buttons and controls surrounding her seat. Naomi's heart immediately went out to the woman. She knelt beside the seat, her voice gentle. "Don't worry about a thing. I'm here to help. This is your first time flying alone internationally?" "Yes," Mrs. McCann nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I'm visiting my grandchildren in Okinawa. They're stationed at the military base there. I promised Harold before he passed that I'd make this trip. He would be proud of you," Naomi said, carefully securing the seatbelt and showing Mrs. McCann how to adjust her seat. "And I'll check on you throughout the flight. You're going to do just fine." 3 rows ahead, Steven Seagal sat in quiet contemplation, a slim volume of Zen poetry open in his lap. At 72, his imposing frame still commanded attention, though he wore it now with the understated dignity of a man who had nothing left to prove. His dark hair was silver at the temples, his face weathered by decades of real conflict and spiritual searching. He wore a simple black suit, well-tailored but not flashy, the kind of practical elegance that spoke of comfort with oneself rather than concern for others' impressions. The book's pages contained ancient wisdom about finding stillness in chaos, about the warrior's path that led not to conquest, but to peace. Seagal had lived those truths in places most people only saw in movies, had learned that true strength came from knowing when not to act. His eyes, dark and alert, occasionally glanced up from the text to observe the cabin's quiet choreography. Across the aisle, Dr. Yui Tanaka settled into her seat with the methodical precision of someone who approached life through the lens of behavioral science. Her laptop was already open, notes from her recent keynote at UCLA's psychology conference still fresh on the screen. She found herself naturally observing the social dynamics of the cabin, noting how people claimed their territory, how they interacted with the crew, how they navigated the unspoken protocols of first-class travel. "Interesting environment," she murmured to herself, watching Naomi's interactions with various passengers. The flight attendant's body language spoke volumes about her desire to excel, her slight overeagerness to please, the way she compensated for nervousness with extra attention to detail. Several rows back, Gerald Novak had transformed his seat area into a mobile office, expense receipts spread across his tray table like a paper puzzle. At 45, he had perfected the art of corporate invisibility, the ability to blend into any professional environment without making waves. His laptop displayed quarterly reports, his phone buzzed with client emails, and his entire demeanor suggested a man determined to complete the 7-hour flight without engaging with anyone or anything that might complicate his carefully managed existence. The cabin's serenity was broken by the arrival of Carter Vale, who boarded with the kind of theatrical entrance that demanded attention. At 32, he embodied the tech entrepreneur archetype, his expensive casual wear worn with deliberate carelessness, his movements sharp and impatient. A platinum American Express card gleamed in his wallet as he spoke loudly into his phone, his voice carrying the aggressive confidence of someone who had turned modest coding skills into an NFT empire. "Listen, I don't care what the market's doing right now," he barked into the device, oblivious to the stares from other passengers. "We're sitting on digital gold, and if these investors don't see that, they're idiots." Yeah, I'll call you when I land." Naomi approached with her practiced smile, her hands clasped professionally in front of her. "Good evening, Mr. Vale. Welcome aboard. May I help you with your carry-on?" Carter barely glanced at her, waving dismissively as he ended his call. "It's fine where it is," he said, dropping his Louis Vuitton bag carelessly in the aisle. "I'll need the Wi-Fi password immediately, and I want to know about the wine selection. Nothing bottom shelf." "Of course, sir," Naomi replied, her smile never wavering despite the curt dismissal. "I'll get you our wine list right away. And if you'd like, I can stow your bag in the overhead compartment to keep the aisle clear." "I said it's fine," Carter snapped, sliding into his seat with the fluid arrogance of someone accustomed to having his word be final. His eyes swept the cabin, cataloging the other passengers with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing territory. They lingered on Naomi for a moment longer than necessary, something unpleasant flickering in their depths. Dr. Tanaka noticed the interaction from her peripheral vision, her professional instincts cataloging the microaggressions and power plays already beginning to unfold. Gerald Novak deliberately avoided eye contact, burying himself deeper in his paperwork. Mrs. McCann seemed oblivious, still fiddling with her seat controls. But Steven Seagal watched with the quiet intensity of a man who had spent decades reading human nature in high-stakes situations. He saw the tightness around Naomi's eyes, the way her shoulders tensed slightly as she retreated to gather the wine list. He saw Carter's smirk as he adjusted his seat, already plotting his next move in whatever game he was playing. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane began its taxi toward the runway. Outside the oval windows, the sprawling lights of Los Angeles stretched toward the horizon, a glittering tapestry of lives and stories intersecting in the darkness. But inside the pressurized cocoon of first class, a different kind of story was beginning to unfold. Naomi returned with the wine list, her professional demeanor intact despite the earlier dismissal. "Here you are, Mr. Vale. We have an excellent selection of both domestic and international wines. I'd particularly recommend the—" "I'll be the judge of that," Carter interrupted, snatching the list from her hands without thanks. His fingers brushed hers deliberately, lingering just long enough to make the contact feel intentional and uncomfortable. "First time working international routes?" "Yes, sir," Naomi replied, her voice carefully neutral. "But I'm looking forward to providing you with excellent service." Carter's smile was sharp and predatory. "We'll see about that," he said, his tone carrying implications that made Naomi's stomach tighten. "I have very high standards." As the plane lifted off into the night sky, climbing toward its cruising altitude above the Pacific, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just Naomi's professionalism, but the moral courage of everyone in the cabin. The next 7 hours would reveal who they truly were when faced with the choice between comfort and conscience, between safety and standing up for what's right. The calm before the storm was ending, and Steven Seagal closed his book, sensing that the real lessons in human nature were about to begin. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin had settled into the rhythm of a red-eye journey across the Pacific. Most passengers dozed or worked quietly, their reading lights creating small pools of illumination in the darkened space. The soft drone of the engines provided a constant backdrop to the whispered conversations and gentle clinks of glassware as Naomi and her colleague moved through their service routine. Naomi approached Carter's seat with a practiced smile, her service cart stocked with premium beverages and the kind of artisanal snacks that first-class passengers expected. Despite her earlier discomfort, she was determined to provide exemplary service. This was her chance to prove herself on the international stage, and she wouldn't let one difficult passenger derail her dreams. "Good evening, Mr. Vale," she said, softly, mindful of the sleeping passengers nearby. "Would you care for a beverage? We have an excellent selection of sake, including a vintage Junmai Daijinjo that's particularly special." Carter looked up from his laptop, his eyes lingering on her name tag before traveling slowly down her figure in a way that made her skin crawl. "Naomi, right? That's a pretty name. Spanish?" "Thank you, sir. I'm actually Mexican-American, but I was born in San Diego," she replied, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the invasive question. "About that sake, Mexican-American," Carter repeated, his voice carrying a mocking tone. "Well, I suppose that explains the accent. It's cute, very exotic." He leaned back in his seat, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "But I'm not sure a pretty Latina stewardess would know much about properly serving premium sake. It's a very delicate art, you know. Requires a certain cultural understanding." Naomi's smile faltered almost imperceptibly. She had encountered casual racism before, but the combination of his words and tone felt like a slap. "I've been trained in all aspects of first-class service, sir, including the proper presentation of sake." "I'd be happy to." "Trained," Carter interrupted with a laugh that was just loud enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. "Right. Well, let's see what passes for trained these days. I'll have the vintage you mentioned, but I expect it to be served properly. Temperature, glassware, presentation, the whole 9 yards. Think you can handle that, or should I ask for someone more qualified?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Naomi felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. "Of course, sir. I'll prepare it perfectly for you." As she moved toward the galley, her hands trembling slightly, she was acutely aware of the eyes following her. Gerald Novak had looked up from his laptop, his expression uncomfortable but passive. Dr. Tanaka watched with narrowed eyes, her professional instincts recognizing the power dynamics at play. And 3 rows ahead, Steven Seagal sat motionless, his book closed, his attention now fully focused on the unfolding situation. In the galley, Naomi took a deep breath, trying to center herself. She had dealt with difficult passengers before, but something about Carter's particular brand of cruelty felt different. It wasn't just rudeness. It was calculated, designed to undermine her confidence and establish his dominance. She selected the finest sake service, warming the ceramic takuri to precisely the right temperature, choosing the appropriate ichoko cups, arranging everything on a lacquered tray with the attention to detail that would satisfy even the most discerning connoisseur. When she returned to Carter's seat, he was on his phone again, speaking loudly about cryptocurrency markets and dismissing what he called third-world investment opportunities. He held up one finger without looking at her, making her wait while he finished his call. "Yeah, well, you can't expect stability when you're dealing with Latin American markets," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "The help down there just isn't reliable, if you know what I mean. Cultural differences and all that." Naomi stood frozen beside his seat, the sake tray in her hands, while Carter continued his conversation with deliberate volume. She could feel the weight of other passengers' stares, some sympathetic, others merely curious about the uncomfortable drama unfolding in their midst. Dr. Tanaka had turned fully in her seat now, her dark eyes sharp with professional analysis and growing personal indignation. She recognized the textbook pattern of public humiliation as a power play, the way Carter was using Naomi as both target and prop in his performance of dominance. Gerald Novak shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly recognizing the inappropriateness of Carter's behavior, but equally clearly unwilling to intervene. He caught Naomi's eye briefly, his expression apologetic but passive, before returning his attention to his laptop screen. Steven Seagal remained perfectly still, but something had changed in his posture. His shoulders were slightly more squared, his hands resting calmly on the armrests but ready to move. His eyes, dark and steady, tracked every movement, every word, every subtle shift in the cabin's dynamics. Carter finally ended his call with an elaborate sigh. "Sorry about that," he said to Naomi, his tone anything but apologetic. "Business never stops, even at 40,000 feet. Now, let's see what you've got." Naomi began the sake service with practiced precision, her movements graceful despite her inner turmoil. She warmed the ceramic vessel, tested the temperature. With the traditional method, poured the sake with the proper technique that honored both the drink and the recipient. Her training had been thorough, her execution flawless. Carter watched her with the predatory attention of someone looking for flaws to exploit. When she finished, he lifted the cup and took a sip, his expression thoughtful and deliberately theatrical. He said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Not bad, I suppose. Though I have to say, the service felt a bit mechanical. Where I come from, we appreciate a more personal touch." He looked up at her with that same unsettling smile. "Tell me, Naomi, is this your first time serving sake to someone who actually knows what they're talking about?" The question was designed to wound, to make her doubt her competence in front of the other passengers. Naomi felt her face flush, but she kept her voice steady. "I've served sake many times, sir. I'm glad you're enjoying it." "Oh, I didn't say I was enjoying it," Carter replied smoothly. "I said it wasn't bad. There's a difference. But I suppose for someone with your background, not bad is probably the best we can hope for." The words landed like physical blows. Naomi's hands tightened on the service tray, her knuckles white against the dark lacquer. She could feel tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Is there anything else I can get for you, sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter leaned back in his seat, clearly enjoying her discomfort. "Actually, yes. I think I'll have some of that wine after all. Something European, if you have it. I'm not really in the mood for anything too exotic tonight." The emphasis on the word exotic was unmistakable, another casual cruelty disguised as preference. Naomi nodded stiffly and turned to go, desperate to escape to the galley where she could collect herself. But as she moved past Dr. Tanaka's seat, the psychologist caught her eye and gave her a small, encouraging nod. It was a tiny gesture, but it carried the weight of recognition and support. Someone had seen what was happening. Someone understood. And 3 rows ahead, Steven Seagal finally opened his book again, but his eyes never left the pages. His breathing remained calm and measured, but something fundamental had shifted in his demeanor. The warrior's stillness was no longer about peace. It was about preparation. The fault lines were beginning to show, and everyone in the cabin could feel the pressure building. The question was no longer whether something would break, but when and how much damage would be done when it did. The cabin had grown quieter. As the flight progressed deeper into the night, most passengers settling into the rhythm of overnight travel. Soft blue lighting created an intimate atmosphere, punctuated by the gentle hum of the engines and the occasional whisper of conversation. But beneath the surface tranquility, tension crackled like electricity before a storm. Carter Vale had consumed 3 glasses of wine in the past hour, each drink making him more animated and less concerned with the social niceties that kept first-class cabins civilized. His voice carried easily through the hushed space, no longer making any pretense of consideration for his fellow passengers. "You know what the problem is with this industry," he announced to Gerald Novak, who had made the mistake of acknowledging his earlier comment about market volatility. "Everything's gone soft. Used to be, you could count on proper service, people who knew their place. Now everyone thinks they're entitled to respect they haven't earned." Gerald shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his laptop forgotten as he found himself reluctantly drawn into Carter's monologue. "I'm not sure I follow," he said cautiously, though his expression suggested he understood exactly what Carter was implying. "Come on, don't be naive," Carter continued, his voice rising slightly. "Look around. Half the crew probably couldn't get jobs in their own countries, so they end up here, pretending to understand luxury service. That little stewardess, for instance, sweet kid, I'm sure, But does she really have the cultural sophistication to serve a vintage sake? I mean, let's be honest about what we're dealing with here. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Dr. Tanaka's pen stopped moving across her notepad, her professional composure cracking as she processed the blatant prejudice being casually expressed. She had spent years studying the psychology of discrimination, but witnessing it firsthand in such a confined space felt different, more personal, more urgent. Mrs. McCann stirred in her seat, her elderly features creased with confusion and growing distress. She had been dozing fitfully, but the increasingly loud conversation was impossible to ignore. "That young woman has been nothing but kind to me," she whispered to no one in particular, her voice carrying the moral clarity that sometimes came with age and loss. Naomi approached from the galley, carrying a tray of warm towels for the passengers, who had requested them. She moved with practiced efficiency, but her earlier encounter with Carter had left her confidence shaken. Every step felt precarious, every interaction fraught with the potential for another humiliating encounter. As she passed Carter's seat, he looked up with that same predatory smile. "Ah, there's our little cultural ambassador. Tell me, Naomi, what's your educational background? Did you study hospitality management? Or are you more of a learn-on-the-job kind of person?" The question was phrased politely enough, but its intent was clear. Naomi paused, her grip tightening on the service tray. "I have a degree in hospitality management from San Diego State University, sir. I also completed advanced training in international service protocols." "San Diego State," Carter repeated, his tone suggesting he was filing away the information for future use. "That's nice. Very practical. I bet they have excellent diversity programs there. Really helps level the playing field, doesn't it?" The implication was unmistakable. Naomi felt her face flush with anger and humiliation, but she forced herself to maintain her professional demeanor. "I earned my degree through hard work and academic excellence, sir. Is there anything else I can get for you?" "Actually, yes," Carter said, his smile widening. "I'm curious about your training. Did they teach you about the traditional Japanese tea ceremony? The cultural significance of sake and Shinto rituals? The proper way to serve absinthe? I'm genuinely interested in what passes for advanced training these days." Each question was designed to expose gaps in her knowledge, to make her feel inadequate and out of her depth. Naomi's hands trembled slightly as she realized she was being systematically torn down in front of the other passengers, turned into a symbol of everything Carter felt was wrong with the world. Steven Seagal had been listening to every word, his book now completely forgotten. His breathing remained steady, but his eyes had taken on the focused intensity of a hunter tracking his prey. Years of martial arts training had taught him to recognize the moment when conflict became inevitable, when the choice was no longer between peace and violence, but between justice and complicity. "I'm familiar with all the cultural traditions you mentioned, sir," Naomi replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I should continue with my service duties now. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Of course you should," Carter said, his tone dripping with false understanding. "Wouldn't want to keep the paying customers waiting. Though I have to say, for someone with such extensive training, you seem a bit overwhelmed. Maybe the pressure of international service is more than you're used to?" Gerald Novak couldn't take it anymore. He had spent his entire career avoiding confrontation, but watching another human being systematically humiliated was testing the limits of his moral cowardice. "I think she's doing a fine job," he said quietly, his voice shaking slightly with the effort of speaking up. Carter turned to him with delighted surprise. "Oh, really? And what exactly qualifies you to judge airline service? Are you in the hospitality industry, Gerald? Because I've been flying first class for 15 years, and I can tell you that standards have definitely declined." "I just think we should treat people with respect," Gerald replied, his voice growing slightly stronger. "Regardless of their background or anything else." "Respect," Carter repeated, as if the word was foreign to him. "That's a very noble sentiment. But respect is earned, not given. And in my experience, when you lower your standards to accommodate people who frankly aren't qualified to be here, everyone suffers. The service suffers, the experience suffers, and ultimately, the whole industry suffers." Dr. Tanaka had heard enough. She looked up from her notepad, her dark eyes flashing with controlled anger. Actually, research shows that diverse teams consistently outperform homogeneous ones in both creativity and problem-solving. Your assumptions about qualifications based on ethnicity are not only offensive but demonstrably false. Carter's expression shifted, surprised to find organized resistance to his casual bigotry. Oh, we have an expert here? Let me guess, sociology professor? Women's studies? One of those fields where feelings matter more than facts. I'm a behavioral psychologist, Dr. Tanaka replied calmly. I study power dynamics and social interaction. And what I'm observing right now is a textbook example of compensatory aggression, attacking others to mask your own insecurities. The words landed like a physical blow. Carter's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment, his carefully constructed facade of superiority cracking under professional analysis. You don't know what you're talking about, he sputtered. I'm a successful entrepreneur. I've built something from nothing. I don't need to compensate for anything. Of course not, Dr. Tanaka replied, her voice carrying the deadly calm of someone who had found their target's weakness. That's why you feel the need to establish dominance over service workers. It's perfectly normal behavior for someone who's completely secure in their achievements. The cabin fell silent except for the constant drone of the engines. Even Mrs. McCann had turned to watch the confrontation, her elderly eyes sharp with the kind of moral clarity that came from having lived through enough human folly to recognize it when she saw it. Naomi stood frozen in the aisle, caught between her training to remain neutral and her growing realization that this situation was spiraling beyond her control. She could feel the weight of all the eyes in the cabin, the way the other passengers were being forced to choose sides in a conflict that had started with her humiliation but had grown into something much larger. And in seat 3A, Steven Seagal finally closed his book with a soft sound that somehow carried through the entire cabin. He placed it carefully in the seat pocket, his movements deliberate and unhurried. His dark eyes swept the cabin, taking in the defensive postures, the held breath, the electric tension that preceded violence. Carter was breathing heavily now, his earlier swagger replaced by the dangerous unpredictability of a cornered animal. You people think you're so smart, he said, his voice low and venomous. But you don't understand how the real world works. Money talks, and everything else is just noise. The pressure in the cabin was building toward a breaking point, and everyone could feel it. The question was no longer whether the situation would explode, but how catastrophic the explosion would be when it came. The first-class cabin had become a pressure cooker, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tensions and barely contained anger. What had started as casual cruelty had escalated into something far more dangerous, with Carter Vale's mask of civilized behavior slipping away to reveal the raw, ugly truth beneath. You know what? Carter announced, his voice slurred from wine and emboldened by what he perceived as his moral victory over the bleeding hearts around him. I think I need another drink. Something stronger this time. He pressed the call button repeatedly, the electronic chime echoing through the cabin like an alarm. Naomi appeared within moments, her professional smile strained but intact. Yes, sir? How can I help you? I want a whiskey, Carter said, his words slightly slurred. Top shelf. None of that rail liquor garbage. And make it a double. Naomi hesitated, her training kicking in. Sir, I notice you've had several drinks. This evening, perhaps I could offer you some water or coffee instead. We'll be serving breakfast in a few hours, and are you cutting me off? Carter's voice rose dangerously, drawing attention from every passenger in the cabin. Do you have any idea how much I paid for this seat? How much I spend with this airline every year? Sir, I'm not cutting you off, Naomi replied carefully, her voice steady despite the warning bells going off in her head. I'm simply suggesting that perhaps you're suggesting nothing, Carter interrupted, his voice now loud enough to wake the few passengers who had been sleeping. You're a flight attendant, not a bartender, and definitely not my mother. Your job is to bring me what I order, not to lecture me about my drinking habits. The cabin fell silent except for the constant hum of the engines. Mrs. McCann was fully awake now, her elderly hands gripping the armrests of her seat as she watched the confrontation unfold. Gerald Novak had closed his laptop, his earlier attempt at intervention seeming to have made things worse rather than better. Dr. Tanaka was taking notes again, but her pen moved with sharp, angry strokes across the page. She had seen this pattern before in her research. The escalation from verbal abuse to physical intimidation, the way alcohol stripped away the thin veneer of civilization to reveal the predator beneath. "Sir, I understand you're frustrated," Naomi said, her training taking over even as her instincts screamed at her to run. "But I need to follow FAA regulations regarding alcohol service." "I'd be happy to. Regulations?" Carter laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You want to talk about regulations? Let me tell you about regulations. I employ 300 people. I pay more in taxes than you make in 5 years. I don't need some DI hire explaining regulations to me." The words hit Naomi like a physical blow. She had endured the casual racism, the condescending questions, the systematic attempts to undermine her competence. But this direct attack on her qualifications, the suggestion that she hadn't earned her position through merit, was too much. "I earned my position through hard work and dedication, sir," she said, her voice shaking with controlled anger. "I've worked for this airline for 5 years, and I've never had a complaint about my service or my professionalism. Until tonight," Carter replied with a cruel smile. "Because tonight, you're dealing with someone who has standards. Someone who knows the difference between real service and whatever affirmative action nonsense passes for hospitality these days." That's when he stood up. The movement was sudden and aggressive, designed to intimidate. At 6 feet tall, Carter loomed over Naomi's smaller frame, using his size to create a sense of physical threat. The airline aisle was narrow, and his proximity made escape difficult. "You want to know what real service looks like?" he continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried through the entire cabin. "Real service is about knowing your place. It's about understanding that the customer is always right, especially when that customer is subsidizing your little social experiment." Naomi took a step back, but the beverage cart blocked her retreat. She was trapped between Carter's advancing form and the metal barrier, her professional training warring with her basic survival instincts. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You're making me and the other passengers uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" Carter's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You think you're uncomfortable now? Let me tell you something, sweetheart. I could have you fired with one phone call. I could make sure you never work for a major airline again. I have that kind of power." The threat was explicit now, no longer hidden behind layers of casual bigotry and condescending questions. This was raw intimidation, the kind of abuse that powerful men had been visiting on vulnerable women for centuries. Dr. Tanaka had stopped taking notes, her hand hovering over her phone as she debated whether to start recording. Gerald Novak was leaning forward in his seat, his face pale with the recognition that he was witnessing something that crossed the line from uncomfortable to dangerous. And then Carter reached out and grabbed Naomi's wrist. The contact was swift and brutal, his fingers closing around her wrist with enough force to leave marks. Naomi gasped, more from shock than pain, but the violation was complete. The last boundary had been crossed, the final line breached. "Let go of me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the engine noise. "I'll let go when you understand who you're talking to," Carter replied, his grip tightening. "When you show me the respect I deserve." The cabin erupted in a chorus of shocked gasps and angry voices. Mrs. McCann cried out in distress, her elderly voice carrying the moral outrage of someone who had lived through enough history to recognize evil when she saw it. "That's enough," Gerald Novak shouted, finally finding his courage. "Let her go?" Dr. Tanaka was on her feet now, her phone in her hand. "I'm recording this," she announced loudly. "This is assault, and I'm documenting every second of it." But Carter seemed beyond caring about consequences. The alcohol, the humiliation, the challenge to his perceived authority had pushed him past the point of rational thought. He was operating on pure predatory instinct now, his grip on Naomi's wrist the physical manifestation of his need to dominate and control. "You're all going to regret this," he snarled, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I have lawyers, I have money, I have influence. You think you can gang up on me? You think you can?" That's when Steven Seagal stood up. The movement was fluid and unhurried, like water flowing uphill. There was no dramatic gesture, no threatening posture, just a man rising from his seat with the kind of calm certainty that comes from absolute mastery of oneself and one's environment. The effect was immediate and profound. Every eye in the cabin turned to him, drawn by something indefinable but unmistakable. It wasn't his size, though he was impressively built. It wasn't his age, though the silver in his hair spoke of decades of experience. It was something deeper, more fundamental, the presence of someone who had walked through fire and emerged not just unburned, but transformed. Carter's grip on Naomi's wrist loosened slightly as he turned to face this new threat. "What do you want, old man?" he demanded, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. Steven Seagal said nothing at first. He simply stood in the aisle, his dark eyes fixed on Carter with the kind of steady attention that made small predators remember they were prey. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "Let go of her hand." The words were simple, direct, and completely without negotiation. There was no threat, no ultimatum, just a quiet statement of what was going to happen. The cabin fell silent except for the steady drone of the engines, 40,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, where the only law was the one that decent people made for themselves. Carter's face cycled through a range of emotions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally, something that might have been fear. He was still holding Naomi's wrist, but his grip had loosened considerably. The easy confidence that had carried him through his campaign of harassment was nowhere to be found. "This is none of your business," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Stay out of it." Steven Seagal took a single step forward, and somehow that small movement changed everything. The distance between them remained substantial, but the psychological space had collapsed entirely. Carter suddenly found himself face to face with something he had never encountered before, a man who was completely unafraid, completely centered, and completely prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect the innocent. "I'm going to say it one more time," Seagal said, his voice even softer than before. "Let go of her hand." The cabin held its breath. 40,000 feet above the Pacific, in a pressurized tube traveling at 600 miles per hour, the most important question in the world was whether a bully would learn the difference between power and strength, between dominance and dignity. Carter's hand opened, and Naomi's wrist was free. The moment Carter's fingers released Naomi's wrist, the entire cabin seemed to exhale collectively. But the tension didn't dissipate. It transformed, shifting from the chaotic energy of unchecked aggression to something more focused, more controlled. Steven Seagal remained perfectly still in the aisle, his presence filling the space with a kind of gravitational pull that made everything else seem to orbit around him. Naomi stumbled backward, her freed hand instinctively rubbing the red marks. Carter's grip had left on her wrist. Her dark eyes were wide with a mixture of relief and residual fear, her professional composure finally cracking to reveal the frightened young woman beneath. She looked up at Seagal with an expression of gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the constant hum of the engines. Seagal's response was a barely perceptible nod, his attention never leaving Carter, who stood frozen in the narrow aisle like a deer caught in headlights. The cryptocurrency mogul's face had gone through a remarkable transformation in the span of seconds, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. He was clearly a man unaccustomed to being denied, let alone challenged by someone who radiated such quiet authority. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Carter demanded, but his voice lacked the venom it had carried moments before. There was something about Seagal's stillness that seemed to drain the fight out of him, like a flame being slowly starved of oxygen. "I'm just a passenger," Seagal replied, his voice maintaining that same soft, measured tone. "Same as you. The difference is, I know how to behave like one." The words were delivered without heat, without judgment, but they landed with devastating precision. Carter's face flushed red, a combination of embarrassment and rage warring across his features. He was clearly struggling with the cognitive dissonance of being dressed down by someone who hadn't raised his voice or made a single threatening gesture. "You don't know who you're messing with," Carter said, but even he seemed to realize how hollow the threat sounded. "I could buy and sell you 10 times over. I have connections, influence. Money isn't character." Seagal interrupted gently, his dark eyes never wavering from Carter's face. An influence without wisdom is just noise. You've been making a lot of noise tonight. Dr. Tanaka watched the exchange with the fascination of a researcher observing a perfect case study in power dynamics. She had spent years studying confrontational behavior, but she had never seen anything quite like this. Seagal wasn't dominating Carter through intimidation or aggression. He was simply refusing to be intimidated himself, and somehow that refusal was more powerful than any threat could have been. Gerald Novak found himself leaning forward in his seat, mesmerized despite himself. In his corporate world, conflicts were resolved through complex negotiations, legal maneuvering, and carefully worded emails. This was something entirely different, too. Men standing face to face, one representing everything wrong with unchecked privilege, the other embodying a kind of moral authority that seemed to come from some deeper source. Mrs. McCann had pressed herself back into her seat, her elderly hands clutched together in her lap. But her eyes were bright with something that might have been hope. She had lived through enough decades to recognize the rare moments when good actually stood up to evil, when someone finally said, "Enough," to the bullies of the world. Carter took a step backward, his earlier aggression replaced by uncertainty. The confined space of the aircraft aisle suddenly felt enormous, the distance between him and Seagal seeming to stretch like a chasm. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. But his voice lacked conviction. "I was just having a conversation with the flight attendant. There's no law against grabbing someone against their will is assault," Dr. Tanaka interjected, her voice crisp with professional authority. "I recorded the entire incident. Your conversation crossed several legal lines." Carter's head snapped toward her, his eyes wild with the desperate look of a cornered animal. "You recorded me? That's illegal. You can't record someone without their consent." "Actually, I can," Dr. Tanaka replied calmly. "You're in a public space, and you were committing a crime. The law is quite clear on this matter." The noose was tightening around Carter's bravado, and everyone in the cabin could see it. His earlier confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by the frantic energy of someone who suddenly realized that actions have consequences, even for the wealthy and privileged. "Look," Carter said, his voice taking on a wheedling tone as he turned back to Seagal. "Maybe we all got a little carried away here. Travel stress, you know? Why don't we just forget this whole thing happened? I'm sure we can work something out." Seagal's expression didn't change, but something shifted. In his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been disappointment. "The lady deserves an apology," he said simply. "A real one. Not because you're caught, but because you hurt her." "An apology?" Carter's voice cracked slightly. "To her? I mean, I didn't really hurt anyone. It was just a misunderstanding." "You grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave marks," Seagal said, his voice still soft but carrying an edge of steel. "You called her qualifications into question based on her ethnicity. You used your size and position to intimidate her. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a choice." The words hit Carter like physical blows. He looked around the cabin desperately, searching for an ally, someone who might take his side or at least offer him an escape route. But every face he saw reflected varying degrees of disgust, disappointment, or contempt. Even Gerald Novak, who had spent his entire career avoiding confrontation, was looking at him with undisguised revulsion. "Fine," Carter said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Fine, I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry if anyone was offended." "Not to me," Seagal said, nodding toward Naomi, who was still standing frozen beside the beverage cart. "To her. And not if you offended anyone. You know exactly what you did." Carter's jaw worked silently for a moment, his pride warring with his survival instincts. The cabin waited in absolute silence, 40,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, as a moment of moral reckoning played out in the narrow aisle between first-class seats. Finally, Carter turned toward Naomi, his face a mask of barely controlled humiliation. "I'm sorry," he said, the words seeming to physically pain him. I was out of line. You didn't deserve that." Naomi looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "Thank you for the apology. But what you did tonight, that's not who I am, and it's not what I deserved. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I'm good at my job. You try to make me forget that." The words carried a dignity that made Carter's earlier attacks seem even more petty and cruel by comparison. Here was a young woman who had endured systematic humiliation and assault, and still found the strength to assert her worth and humanity. Carter nodded jerkily, his face burning with shame. Right? Yes. You're good at your job. It wasn't much of an apology, but it was acknowledgement. More importantly, it was surrender. The bully had been forced to look his victim in the eye and admit his wrongdoing, and everyone in the cabin had witnessed it. Seagal stepped slightly to one side, creating space in the aisle. I think it would be best if you return to your seat now, he said to Carter, his voice returning to its earlier gentleness. The rest of the flight should be peaceful. Carter nodded again, moving past Seagal with the careful deference of someone who had just learned the difference between authority and authoritarianism. As he slumped back into his seat, he seemed somehow smaller, diminished by the encounter. Seagal turned to Naomi, his weathered face softening with something that might have been paternal concern. Are you all right? He asked quietly. Naomi nodded, though tears were gathering in her eyes. Not tears of pain or fear, but of relief and gratitude. Thank you, she said again. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't. You would have handled it, Seagal said firmly. You were handling it. Sometimes we just need someone to remind bullies that they're not the strongest people in the room. As Naomi retreated to the galley to compose herself, the cabin slowly began to return to its previous quiet rhythm. But something fundamental had changed. The passengers had witnessed something rare and powerful, the moment when quiet strength triumphed over loud aggression, when moral courage stood up to privileged cruelty. Dr. Tanaka made a final note in her journal, then looked up at Seagal with professional admiration. That was masterfully done, she said quietly. You defused the situation without escalating the violence. Seagal shrugged slightly as he returned to his seat. Violence should always be the last resort, he said. Most problems can be solved with patience and the right words. And if they can't, Gerald Novak found himself asking, his curiosity overcoming his usual reticence. Seagal's eyes met his with that same steady calm. Then you do what you have to do, but you try everything else first. As the aircraft continued its journey across the Pacific, the first-class cabin settled into a new equilibrium. Carter sat in sullen silence, his earlier bravado completely extinguished. The other passengers exchanged quiet conversations, processing what they had witnessed. And Steven Seagal opened his book of Zen poetry again, returning to his meditation on the warrior's path that led not to conquest, but to peace. The crisis had passed, but its lessons would linger long after the plane touched down in Tokyo. The aftermath of confrontation settled over the first-class cabin like morning mist, subtle but transformative. What had been a luxurious cocoon of privilege 30 minutes earlier had become something else entirely, a community of strangers, bound together by shared witness to both human cruelty and unexpected heroism. The soft ambient lighting seemed somehow different now, illuminating faces that had been changed by what they had seen and, more importantly, by how they had chosen to respond. Naomi emerged from the galley after several minutes, her composure restored, but her eyes still bright with unshed tears. She moved through the cabin with renewed purpose, no longer the nervous young woman desperate to prove herself, but someone who had been tested in fire and emerged with a clearer understanding of her own worth. The red marks on her wrist were already beginning to fade, but the lesson they represented would last much longer. Miss Ruiz. Mrs. McCann's voice was soft, but clear as Naomi passed her seat. The elderly woman reached out with a weathered hand, her fingers gentle but insistent. Could I speak with you for just a moment? Naomi paused, her professional instincts warring with her emotional exhaustion. But something in the older woman's eyes made her stop and lean down beside the seat. I wanted to tell you something important, Mrs. McCann continued, her voice carrying the weight of 8 decades of life experience. What that man said about you, what he tried to make you believe about yourself, none of it was true. You are competent, you are professional, and you are worthy of respect. Don't you ever let anyone make you feel otherwise. The words hit Naomi with unexpected force. She had been so focused on maintaining her professional demeanor, on proving she could handle the situation, that she hadn't allowed herself to process the deeper wounds Carter's attacks had inflicted. Mrs. McCann's simple affirmation felt like a balm on injuries she hadn't even realized she was carrying. "Thank you," Naomi whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." Mrs. McCann squeezed her hand gently. "I raised 3 daughters," she said with a small smile. "I know what it looks like when someone is trying to tear down a good woman. And I know what it looks like when that woman refuses to be torn down." 3 rows ahead, Dr. Tanaka was reviewing the notes she had taken throughout the incident, her academic mind already processing the psychological dynamics she had observed. But as she watched the interaction between Naomi and Mrs. McCann, she felt compelled to add her own voice to the conversation. "Excuse me," she said, rising from her seat and approaching Naomi with the careful politeness of someone who understood the delicate nature of the moment. "I hope you don't mind my intruding, but I wanted to offer you something." She extended a business card, her expression serious but kind. "I'm a behavioral psychologist specializing in workplace harassment and power dynamics. What happened tonight was textbook intimidation behavior, and your response was exemplary. If you ever need documentation of the incident, professional testimony, or just someone to talk to who understands the psychology of what you experienced, please don't hesitate to contact me." Naomi accepted the card with trembling fingers, reading the embossed text that identified Dr. Tanaka as a professor at Tokyo University with specializations in conflict resolution and social psychology. "You really think I handled it well?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "You maintained your professionalism under extreme duress," Dr. Tanaka replied firmly. "You stood up for yourself without escalating the situation. You showed remarkable restraint and dignity in the face of deliberate provocation. Yes, you handled it exceptionally well." The validation from someone with professional expertise in human behavior meant more to Naomi than any employee evaluation or customer compliment ever could. She carefully tucked the business card into her uniform pocket, a tangible reminder that she had not been imagining the severity of what she had endured. Gerald Novak had been listening to the conversation with growing discomfort, not because of what was being said, but because of what it revealed about his own earlier inaction. He had sat frozen while a fellow human being was being systematically humiliated, paralyzed by his ingrained instinct to avoid involvement at all costs. The shame of that realization was eating at him like acid. "Miss Ruiz," he called out softly as she prepared to continue with her duties. When she turned toward him, he saw his own cowardice reflected in her eyes, and it nearly broke him. "I owe you an apology too." Naomi looked surprised. "Sir, you didn't do anything wrong." "That's exactly the problem," Gerald replied, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. "I didn't do anything at all. I sat here and watched while you were being attacked, and I did nothing. I'm sorry for that. You deserved better from all of us." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Gerald had spent his entire career in corporate environments where avoiding risk was rewarded and standing up was often punished. But sitting here now, having witnessed genuine courage in action, he realized how hollow that philosophy was when applied to basic human decency. "Fear makes cowards of us all sometimes," Naomi said gently, surprising herself with her own capacity for forgiveness. "But you spoke up when it mattered. That counts for something." "Not soon enough," Gerald replied. "But maybe next time I'll do better." The conversation was interrupted by movement from the back of the cabin. The air marshal, Dennis Cole, had been watching the entire incident unfold with the trained eye of someone whose job was to assess and neutralize threats. He had been prepared to intervene physically if necessary, but Seagal's handling of the situation had been so masterful that official action had become unnecessary. Now he approached the group with the measured steps of someone accustomed to defusing post-crisis situations. His badge was discreetly visible, and his presence carried the weight of federal authority. "Miss Ruiz," he said quietly, "I'm Air Marshal Cole. I observed the entire incident, and I want you to know that if you choose to file charges when we land, you'll have my full support and testimony." What Mr. Vale did constituted assault under federal aviation law. Naomi looked up at him with surprise. She had been so focused on the immediate crisis that she hadn't even considered the legal implications of what had happened. "Charges? Grabbing you against your will, using his size to intimidate you, threatening your employment. All of that constitutes criminal behavior at 35,000 feet, Marshal Cole explained. The choice is yours, but you should know that you have options. The idea of pursuing legal action was both empowering and terrifying. Naomi had spent her entire career trying to smooth over conflicts, to de-escalate situations rather than escalate them. But perhaps there were times when escalation was exactly what was needed to prevent future victims. I'll need to think about it, she said finally. Of course, Marshal Cole replied. Take all the time you need. The important thing is that you know you're not powerless here. As the marshal returned to his seat, Steven Seagal looked up from his book. Throughout the conversations, he had remained quietly in his seat, allowing others to offer their support and validation. But now he caught Naomi's eye and gave her a small nod of approval. You found your voice, he said simply. Don't lose it again. The words were sparse, but they carried the weight of recognition from someone who clearly understood the difference between strength and weakness, between power and authority. Coming from the man who had stood up for her when no one else would, they felt like a benediction. Carter Vale remained in his seat throughout these exchanges, a forgotten presence at the edge of the newly formed community. His earlier aggression had been replaced by a sullen silence that spoke of a man wrestling with the ruins of his self-image. The easy confidence that had carried him through life was nowhere to be found, replaced by the uncomfortable recognition that money and status were poor shields against moral judgment. Dr. Tanaka noticed his isolation and made a professional observation. Shame can be a powerful teacher, she said quietly to the group. The question is whether he'll learn from it or simply nurse his resentment. Some people can't change, Mrs. McCann said with the pragmatic wisdom of someone who had lived through enough human drama to recognize its patterns. But that doesn't mean we stop doing what's right. As the cabin settled back into its overnight rhythm, the transformation was complete but subtle. The same passengers occupied the same seats, but the dynamics between them had shifted fundamentally. A community of conscience had formed around shared values rather than shared privilege, bound together by the recognition that dignity and respect were not commodities to be bought and sold. Naomi resumed her duties with a new sense of purpose, her interactions with passengers marked by increased confidence and self-assurance. Mrs. McCann dozed peacefully, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. Gerald Novak stared out the window at the starlit ocean below, contemplating the man he had been and the man he might become. And Steven Seagal returned to his poetry, reading ancient words about the warrior's path that led not to conquest but to peace, while the aircraft carried them all toward a new day over the Pacific. The fragile peace that had settled over the first-class cabin proved to be temporary. Carter Vale sat in his seat for nearly an hour, stewing in a toxic mixture of humiliation, alcohol, and wounded pride. The conversations around him had made it clear that he was now the pariah of the cabin, the man whose behavior had marked him as unworthy of the basic respect that civilized people accorded one another. For someone who had built his entire identity around dominance and control, this social exile was more devastating than any physical confrontation could have been. He watched as Naomi moved through the cabin with renewed confidence, saw the way. Other passengers smiled at her and treated her with genuine warmth, and felt each interaction like a personal rebuke. The alcohol in his system made the rational part of his mind increasingly difficult to access, while amplifying every grievance and perceived slight. In his altered state, the evening's events began to reshape themselves in his memory, taking on the distorted logic of someone who could never accept responsibility for his own actions. He hadn't assaulted anyone. He had simply been trying to get proper service. He hadn't been racist. He had just been honest about declining standards. He hadn't been threatening. He had simply been standing up for himself against a coordinated attack by bleeding-heart liberals who wanted to destroy successful people like him. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that he was the real victim here. That old man, whoever he was, had assaulted him by threatening him. The flight attendant had been insubordinate. The professor had illegally recorded him. The other passengers had ganged up on him out of jealousy and resentment of his success. By the time these thoughts had fully crystallized in his alcohol-soaked brain, Carter had worked himself into a state of righteous indignation that demanded action. He couldn't let these people get away with what they had done to him. He had rights, he had power, and he was going to use both. Carter pressed the call button again, but this time he held it down, letting the electronic chime sound repeatedly through the cabin. When Naomi appeared, her expression carefully neutral, he was ready with his attack. "I want to speak to the captain," he announced loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "I want to file a formal complaint about the service on this flight, and I want to report an assault by one of the passengers." The words fell into the quiet cabin like a hand grenade. Every head turned toward Carter's seat, expressions ranging from disbelief to outrage. Naomi's face went pale, but she maintained her professional composure. "Sir, if you have concerns about the service, I'd be happy to address them with you directly, or you can speak with my supervisor when we land," she replied carefully. "No," Carter said, his voice rising. "This has gone far beyond customer service issues. I was physically threatened by that man." He pointed directly at Steven Seagal, "and I want him arrested when we land. I also want you disciplined for your unprofessional behavior and failure to provide proper service." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Dr. Tanaka was already reaching for her phone, preparing to review the video she had recorded. Earlier, Gerald Novak was shaking his head in disbelief, finally understanding the true depths of Carter's self-delusion. But it was Air Marshal Cole who responded first, rising from his seat with the calm authority of someone accustomed to dealing with delusional passengers. "Mr. Vale," he said, his voice carrying the weight of federal law enforcement, "I'm Air Marshal Cole, and I observed the entire incident you're referring to. No assault took place. In fact, the only person who made physical contact without consent was you, when you grabbed Miss Ruiz's wrist." Carter's face flushed red as he realized he was facing official opposition. But his pride and the alcohol made retreat impossible. "That's not what happened," he insisted. "This is all lies. You people are all conspiring against me because you can't stand to see a successful businessman stand up for proper standards." "I have video evidence of the entire encounter," Dr. Tanaka interjected, holding up her phone. "Would you like me to play it for the marshal?" The offer was made in the spirit of helpful cooperation, but it had the effect of a declaration of war on Carter's already fragile psyche. The idea that his humiliation had been recorded, that there was permanent evidence of his defeat, sent him spiraling into a rage that overrode whatever remained of his judgment. "You recorded me without permission," he shouted, standing up abruptly and pointing an accusatory finger at Dr. Tanaka. "That's illegal. I'm going to sue you for invasion of privacy, for defamation, for—" "Sir, you need to sit down." "Marshal." Cole's voice cut through Carter's tirade with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. "You're in a public space, on a federal aircraft, and you were committing a crime. The recording is completely legal, and if you don't return to your seat immediately, I'll be forced to restrain you." Carter looked around the cabin desperately, searching for an ally, someone who might support his version of events. But every face he saw reflected varying degrees of disgust, pity, or simple desire for him to shut up and sit down. Even the flight crew members who had appeared at the sound of the disturbance were looking at him with the practiced wariness of people who dealt with disruptive passengers on a regular basis. In that moment of social isolation, Carter made the mistake that would define the rest of his flight and quite possibly his legal future. Instead of accepting defeat gracefully, he doubled down on his delusions. "This is all bullshit," he screamed, his voice cracking with frustration and rage. "I know my rights. I know important people. I could buy this whole airline and fire every one of you. You think you can gang up on me because I try to get proper service? You think you can assault me and get away with it?" Steven Seagal had remained motionless throughout Carter's outburst, watching with the patient attention of someone observing a small animal's temper tantrum. But now he spoke, his voice cutting through Carter's hysteria with the calm precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Son," he said quietly, "you're making this worse for yourself. Sit down, be quiet, and when we land, apologize to everyone you've hurt tonight. That's your only way out of this with any dignity intact." The use of the word son was perfectly calculated to inflame Carter's wounded pride. Here was this old man, treating him like a child, speaking to him with the condescending patience usually reserved for toddlers having meltdowns. The fact that Seagal was right only made it more infuriating. "Don't you dare talk down to me," Carter snarled, taking a step toward Seagal's seat. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I've destroyed bigger men than you with a phone call." That was the moment when Marshall Cole decided that words were no longer sufficient. In one fluid motion, he was out of his seat and moving toward Carter, his hand resting on the restraints clipped to his belt. "Mr. Vale, you are now interfering with the operation of this aircraft and threatening other passengers," he announced in the formal tone that preceded arrests. "You need to return to your seat immediately, or I will restrain you and place you under arrest." Carter looked at the marshal, then at Seagal, then around the cabin at the faces staring back at him with mixtures of contempt and pity. For just a moment, reality seemed to penetrate the fog of alcohol and wounded pride. He could see where this was heading, could understand that he was digging his own grave deeper with every word. But pride, that most destructive of human emotions, would not allow him to admit defeat. Instead of accepting the lifeline that Marshall Cole was offering, Carter made one final, catastrophic choice. "Fine," he said, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "But when we land, I'm going to destroy all of you. I have lawyers, I have money, and I have influence. This isn't over." The threat was specific enough and credible enough to cross the final line. Marshall Cole nodded grimly and reached for his restraints. "Mr. Vale, you're under arrest for interference with a flight crew, assault, and making threats against federal officers and passengers." As the handcuffs clicked into place around Carter's wrists, the cabin fell into absolute silence. The bully's last stand had ended not with triumph, but with the complete destruction of any sympathy he might have claimed. He had been given multiple opportunities to salvage some dignity from the situation, and he had chosen escalation every time. Steven Seagal watched the arrest with the same calm expression he had worn throughout the evening. When Carter was finally secured in his seat, flanked by two flight attendants who would monitor him for the remainder of the flight, Seagal offered a quiet observation that seemed to sum up the entire tragedy. "Some people," he said, just loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear, "would rather be right than be decent. And they usually end up being neither." The wisdom of those words settled over the cabin like a benediction, marking the end of a confrontation that had tested everyone's moral courage and found some of them wanting. Carter Vale sat in defeated silence, his hands secured behind his back, finally learning the lesson that money and status were poor shields against the consequences of one's choices. The plane continued its journey across the Pacific, carrying its passengers toward a new day that would find some of them changed for the better and others facing a reckoning they had brought entirely upon themselves. The aftermath of Carter's arrest brought a profound sense of relief to the first-class cabin, as if a fever had finally broken after a long and difficult night. The handcuffed man sat slumped in his seat, all the fight gone out of him, monitored by flight crew members who maintained professional vigilance while the other passengers began the delicate process of returning to normalcy. But this was not the same normalcy they had known at the beginning of the flight. Something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of their shared space, transforming a collection of strangers into a community bonded by shared experience and mutual recognition of each other's humanity. Naomi moved through the cabin with a new sense of purpose, her earlier nervousness replaced by quiet confidence. The trial by fire she had endured had burned away her self-doubt, leaving behind someone who understood her own worth in a way that no amount of training or encouragement could have taught her. "How are you holding up?" Dr. Tanaka asked quietly, as Naomi paused to check on the passengers in her section. "Better than I expected," Naomi replied honestly. "For a while there, I started to believe what he was saying about me. But having all of you stand up, it reminded me who I really am." "Never forget that," Dr. Tanaka said firmly. "People like him specialize in making others doubt themselves. It's how they maintain power over those around them. But you didn't let him break you." Mrs. McCann reached out to touch Naomi's hand as she passed. "Dear, would you mind sitting with me for just a moment? I know you're working, but I'd like to tell you something." Naomi settled into the empty seat beside the elderly woman, grateful for the chance to rest and connect on a human level rather than purely professional one. "I've been thinking about what happened tonight," Mrs. McCann began, her voice soft but clear. "That young man reminded me of someone I knew many years ago, someone who thought his money and position made him better than everyone else. But what I learned is that character isn't something you can buy. It's something you build, choice by choice, day by day." She paused, looking directly into Naomi's eyes with the intensity of someone passing down hard-won wisdom. You showed more character in the last few hours than he's probably shown in his entire life. Don't ever let anyone make you forget that. The simple validation from someone who had lived through 8 decades of human experience meant more to Naomi than any performance review or customer compliment ever could. She squeezed Mrs. McCann's weathered hand gently. "Thank you," she said. "That means everything to me." Gerald Novak had been listening to the conversation from across the aisle, wrestling with his own shame about his earlier inaction. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke up. "Miss Ruiz, I owe you another apology," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I've been thinking about tonight, and I realized that my silence was a form of complicity. I let fear override my basic human decency, and that's not the man I want to be." Naomi turned to face him, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes. "Mr. Novak, you did speak up when it mattered. That took courage." "Not soon enough," Gerald replied. "But maybe that's the lesson here. We can't wait for perfect moments to do the right thing. Sometimes we just have to act, even when we're scared." The conversation was interrupted by Steven Seagal, who had risen from his seat and was approaching their small group. Throughout the crisis and its aftermath, he had remained largely silent, allowing others to process their experiences and find their own voices. But now he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone offering final wisdom. "Miss Ruiz," he said, his voice carrying that same gentle strength that had defused the earlier confrontation. "I wanted to give you something." He handed her a small card with elegant calligraphy that appeared to be Japanese characters alongside an English translation. Naomi read the words aloud. "The bamboo that bends is stronger than the oak that resists." "It's an old saying," Seagal explained. "Sometimes people mistake flexibility for weakness, but real strength comes from knowing when to bend and when to stand firm. You showed both tonight." Naomi studied the card, understanding that she was receiving more than just a philosophical quote. This was recognition from someone who clearly understood the nature of true strength, someone who had chosen to use his power to protect rather than dominate. "You didn't have to help me," she said quietly. "You could have just stayed in your seat like everyone else." "No," Seagal replied with gentle firmness. "When you see someone being hurt, you have a choice. You can be part of the problem, part of the solution, or part of the furniture. I stopped being furniture a long time ago." Air Marshal Cole approached the group, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal approval. "Miss Ruiz, I wanted to update you on the situation. Mr. Vale will be handed over to federal authorities when we land in Tokyo. If you decide to press charges, the case is very strong. We have multiple witnesses, video evidence, and clear federal jurisdiction." "What would happen to him?" Naomi asked, curiosity mixing with concern. "That would depend on the charges and the judge," Cole replied. "But assault on an aircraft, interference with flight crew, and threatening federal officers are serious offenses. He's looking at significant fines and possible jail time. Plus, he'll likely be placed on the no-fly list." The idea that her tormentor would face real consequences was both satisfying and sobering. Naomi had never thought of herself as someone who would pursue legal action, but perhaps there were times when accountability was more important than forgiveness. "I think I want to press charges," she said finally. "Not for revenge, but so maybe he'll think twice before treating someone else this way." "Good for you," Dr. Tanaka said approvingly. Sometimes the soft chime of the seatbelt sign echoed through the cabin as Flight 847 began its descent toward Tokyo's Narita International Airport. Below them, the sprawling lights of Japan's capital region glittered like scattered diamonds against the pre-dawn darkness. The plane's gentle banking motion stirred passengers from the contemplative quiet that had settled over first class during the final hours of their transpacific journey. Naomi moved through the cabin one last time, performing her final service checks with a confidence that would have been unimaginable 12 hours earlier. The frightened young woman who had boarded in Los Angeles was gone, replaced by someone who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. Her interactions with passengers were marked by genuine warmth rather than nervous eagerness to please. As she passed Steven Seagal's seat, he looked up from his book and offered her a small nod of acknowledgement. "You've found your voice," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of recognition from someone who understood the difference between strength and weakness. "Don't lose it again." I won't, Naomi replied with quiet certainty. The simple exchange felt like a benediction, a passing of wisdom from someone who had spent decades learning when to act and when to remain still. Gerald Novak caught her attention. As she passed his row, "Miss Ruiz," he said, his voice carrying newfound resolve. "When we land, I want you to know that if you need a witness for any legal proceedings, you can count on me. I should have spoken up sooner, but I'm not going to. Be silent anymore." Dr. Tanaka overheard the conversation and nodded approvingly. "Courage is contagious," she observed. "One person's willingness to stand up gives others permission to find their own strength." Carter Vale remained slumped in his seat, handcuffed, and silent, his earlier bravado completely extinguished. The consequences of his choices were waiting for him on the ground: federal charges, legal fees, and the kind of public humiliation that money couldn't buy away. Air Marshal Cole sat nearby, maintaining professional vigilance while the broken man contemplated the ruins of his own making. Mrs. McCann dozed peacefully, her weathered face serene with the satisfaction of having witnessed good triumph over evil. In her long life, such moments were precious and rare, worthy of treasuring. Tokyo's morning sun streamed through the terminal windows as passengers filed off Flight 847, carrying with them more than just luggage and jet lag. The first-class cabin emptied slowly, each person processing the night's events in their own way, forever changed by what they had witnessed and how they had chosen to respond. Naomi walked Mrs. McCann to her connecting gate, ensuring the elderly woman was safely transferred to the care of airline staff who would help her reach Okinawa. Before they parted, Mrs. McCann squeezed her hand one final time. "Remember what I told you, dear," she said with a gentle smile. "You are worthy of respect, and you have the strength to demand it." Dr. Tanaka approached Naomi at the gate, pulling out her business card one more time. "I meant what I said about testimony," she said seriously. "But more than that, if you ever doubt yourself again, remember tonight. You stood up to a bully, maintained your dignity under attack, and inspired others to find their courage. That's not training, that's character." Gerald Novak lingered nearby, clearly wanting to say something but struggling with the words. Finally, he stepped forward with the awkward determination of someone making a difficult but necessary choice. "I've been a coward most of my life," he admitted quietly, "always choosing the safe path, never taking risks, never standing up when it mattered. But watching you tonight, watching him, I realized that silence isn't neutrality. It's complicity. Thank you for showing me the difference." Steven Seagal appeared at Naomi's shoulder like a shadow, moving with the same quiet grace that had marked his intervention hours earlier. Without ceremony, he handed her a small folded piece of paper. "A reminder," he said simply, then melted into the crowd of departing passengers with the anonymity of someone who understood that true heroes didn't seek recognition. Naomi unfolded the paper to find elegant handwriting. "Kindness is strength. Don't forget." The words blurred slightly as tears gathered in her eyes. Not tears of pain or fear, but of gratitude and renewed purpose. As the crowd dispersed throughout the bustling terminal, each person carried forward the lessons of their shared experience. Some would return to their lives largely unchanged, but others had been fundamentally altered by witnessing what happened when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things. Carter Vale was led away in federal custody, his empire of cryptocurrency and arrogance crumbling under the weight of consequences he had never imagined could touch him. Air Marshal Cole's report would ensure that justice followed its proper course. But the real victory belonged to those who had discovered their own capacity for moral courage, who had learned that dignity was not a commodity to be bought or sold, but a birthright to be protected and defended. The story would ripple outward from that first-class cabin, told and retold in different versions, but always carrying the same essential truth: that sometimes, when good people stand together, bullies learn the difference between power and strength, between dominance and dignity. In the end, 40,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, humanity had won a small but significant victory over its own worst impulses. And that was worth celebrating, one quiet act of courage at a time. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.